Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step aside. This area is for active military personnel and credentialed guests only. The voice belonged to Captain Derek Holloway, and it cut across the reception hall of Fort Bragg's Heritage Center like a blade drawn in a formal dining room. Sharp, unnecessary, and slightly embarrassing for anyone with enough experience to recognize the sound of entitlement wearing a uniform. He was 29 years old and looked every inch of it. Broad-shouldered, chest gleaming with a row of commendation ribbons he had collected in 3 years of stateside garrison duty, jaw set with the particular firmness of a man who had never once been wrong in front of a subordinate. The woman he was speaking to did not look up. She was 81 years old. The kind of 81 that announces itself not in frailty, but in a quality of perfect stillness, as though the body had long ago decided that unnecessary motion was a luxury youth could afford and wisdom could not. Her name was Eleanor Grace Tatum, and she was standing near the far wall of the reception hall, examining a black and white photograph in a plain wooden frame. She wore a gray cardigan, a white blouse buttoned to the collar, and slacks the color of old fog. Her shoes were sensible and worn at the heel. Her white hair was pinned back with no vanity. She carried a small canvas tote bag that had a hardware store's logo on the side, the letters half faded, which suggested she had been using it since before the hardware store existed. Her hands, resting at her sides, were remarkable. The knuckles were enlarged with age, and the veins stood up beneath tissue paper skin. But they did not tremble. They were the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime doing precise and unforgiving work with them, and the precision had outlasted the youth. She turned from the photograph when Holloway spoke. Her eyes were pale gray, the color of a winter morning before the sun commits, and they held a depth that was difficult to look at directly, not because they were hard, but because they suggested something vast and cold and patient behind them, the way very deep water is still at the surface while currents move far below. "I'm not in anyone's way," she said. Her voice was quiet, the way a door closing in a library is quiet, not hushed, simply unhurried. Holloway smiled with one side of his face. It was the smile of a man who had learned that smiling while being dismissive gave him the moral high ground in the moment and the social cover afterward. He glanced over his shoulder at the 2 junior officers flanking the entrance, Lieutenants Marsh and Co., and made sure they were watching before he continued. "The Heritage reception is for invited personnel and their families," he said, louder now, his voice filling the marble-floored hall the way water fills a jar, efficiently and without apology. "Do you have a guest pass? A program? Any identification verifying you're supposed to be here?" The woman reached into the canvas tote and produced a small square of folded cardstock. A program, ivory with gold lettering, the kind the event staff had been pressing into hands at the door all morning. Holloway looked at it. He did not reach for it. "Those are given to everyone at the entrance," he said. "I've seen tourists pick them up off the welcome table. That doesn't establish that you're a guest." The woman said nothing. She folded the program and placed it back in the tote. "What I'm asking," Holloway said, stepping slightly closer, closing the gap between them to the distance of a mild confrontation, "is what your business is here. This isn't a museum. This isn't open to the public. If you wandered in from the parking lot, that's understandable, but I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Around the room, the polished gathering of officers and visiting dignitaries had begun to notice. The conversations did not stop. They modulated, dropped half a register, tilted in the direction of the far wall the way plants tilt toward light. A colonel near the bar had gone quiet. 2 women in evening dress near the catering table had turned just enough to watch, without appearing to watch. The event had been organized to commemorate the 55th anniversary of a classified operation whose records had only recently been declassified. and the room was full of people with impressive names and longer memories, and several of them had just gotten very still. Holloway did not notice any of this. He was performing, and performers rarely notice their audience until the audience changes shape. "I'm not going to ask again," he said, and now there was the edge in it, the blade unsheathed, the warning that his next action would not be verbal. "I need your name, your affiliation, and your reason for being in this facility. If you cannot provide those things in the next 30 seconds, I am going to have you escorted out." Eleanor Grace Tatum looked at him for a long moment. Her expression did not change. There was no anger in it, and no fear, and no pleading. There was simply the quality of someone who had been measured by better instruments than this, and had not particularly concerned herself with the reading. "My name is Eleanor Grace Tatum," she said in the same unhurried voice. "My affiliation is this installation, and my reason for being here is that I was invited." "By whom?" She looked back at the photograph on the wall. It showed 12 people standing in front of a building that no longer existed, in a country that no longer existed in the form it had held then. The photograph was dated 1968. "By the Army," she said simply. "It tends to remember its own." Holloway's jaw tightened. He turned fully to face her now, squaring his shoulders, adopting the physical posture that junior officers sometimes mistake for authority. His hand moved to the back of her elbow, not gripping, not quite, but present. The suggestion of a redirect. His fingers were perhaps 2 inches from the small silver pin on her cardigan, worn near the collar, partially obscured by the fabric of her lapel. The pin was small. It was not decorative. It was the shape of a lightning bolt, worn smooth from decades of handling, with something engraved on the back that no one in this room had yet been close enough to read. The moment his fingertips brushed the edge of her sleeve, the Heritage Center's marble floors dissolved. The smell of floor wax and catered food vanished and was replaced, suddenly and completely, by the smell of red clay and monsoon rain, and something metallic that had no clean name but that she had not smelled in 50 years, and knew immediately. The polished hall became a communications shed in the highlands of Vietnam. The roof patched with corrugated tin that drummed under the rain, and a rhythm that she had learned to calculate, because the drumming told you things about barometric pressure that no instrument could tell you faster. She was 24 years old. Her hair was dark and cut short beneath a patrol cap. Her hands were the same hands, the precision was already in them, already permanent. And they were moving over a frequency board with the practiced speed of someone who knew that 3 minutes was the difference between a team coming home and a team not coming home. The shed held 4 people. Specialist Diane Kowalczyk, 20. From Akron. Master Sergeant Roosevelt Rosie Tanner, 32, who had survived Chosin and said so only once and never again. Technical Sergeant Paul Arrieta, 26, who had a wife and a daughter born 6 weeks ago, and whose photograph was taped to the inside of his helmet. And her, Sergeant First Class Eleanor Grace Tatum, who had been in country 14 months, and who was at this moment trying to raise the team that had gone silent 7 minutes ago in the valley. She raised them. The team came back. Not all of it. Specialist Kowalczyk, 20 years old, from Akron, did not come back. She had been on the other end of that frequency, and then she had not been. And Eleanor had stayed on the board for 6 more hours without eating or moving, because staying on the board was the only thing she knew how to do that was not screaming. Rosie Tanner had found her at hour 7. He had pressed the small lightning bolt pin into her palm. He had said, without any ceremony, she'd have wanted you to have it. She said you were the best R2 she'd ever worked with. She said you were the reason the team trusted the line. He had folded her fingers around it. His hands were larger than hers and entirely steady. "Don't lose it, Ellie. It's paid for." She had not lost it. She blinked, and the Heritage Center solidified around her, marble and chandeliers and the smell of catered salmon and centerpieces. Holloway's hand was still near her sleeve. She had not moved. Her expression had not changed. But something in the quality of her stillness had shifted, become, if possible, heavier, denser. The stillness of something that has absorbed a great deal and chosen not to release it. Near the entrance, a young Army sergeant named Marcus Webb had been watching the whole thing from his position beside the guest registration table. He was 23, just back from his first deployment to the Horn of Africa. And he had grown up in a house where his grandmother had told him stories about women who served in Vietnam in capacities that the Army had not officially acknowledged until long after the fact. His grandmother had been an Army nurse who'd rotated through Cam Ranh Bay in 1967 and had come home speaking quietly about a signals team that had operated in the Highlands. Women, all of them, pulling frequencies no one was supposed to be pulling, saving lives that history would spend another 30 years pretending they hadn't saved. He did not know this woman by sight, but he felt something in the posture of her stillness that reached back into a story he had been told in a kitchen in Savannah, Georgia. And he knew with the particular instinct of someone who has been in genuine danger and learned to read rooms that something was profoundly wrong with what Holloway was doing. He leaned over to the woman staffing the registration table, a civilian named Patricia, who had worked this installation for 11 years and who had a memory for names that the Army's own databases occasionally could not match, and said quietly, "Who is she?" Patricia looked at the woman by the photograph. She looked for 3 full seconds, and something shifted in her expression. Not surprise, but a kind of urgent recognition, the way a face moves when it identifies something it was not expecting to see but knows immediately. "Go find Colonel Reese," she said. "Right now. Use the side door. Tell him Eleanor Tatum is here and that she's being questioned by a captain who doesn't know what he's looking at." "Is she, Marcus?" Patricia's voice was very quiet and very clear. "Go." Marcus went. He moved through the side door and down the corridor that smelled of institutional carpet and old fluorescent light, and he found Colonel James Reese in the hallway outside the secondary event room, in the middle of a conversation with the deputy installation commander about a logistical matter involving Friday's outdoor ceremony. Marcus waited 4 seconds, then interrupted. He excused himself once, was not heard, and then said clearly, "Sir, Eleanor Grace Tatum is in the Heritage Center. Captain Holloway has been questioning her for several minutes. He has his hand near her person." Colonel Reese's conversation stopped, not paused, not redirected. Stopped, the way a record stops when the needle is pulled, with a sudden absence of everything that had been filling the air a moment before. He turned to look at Marcus with an expression that Marcus had seen exactly once in his life, on a platoon sergeant in Djibouti, who had just heard a report that did not add up and whose face had gone very still and very calculating while his mind ran the numbers on how bad this was and how fast. It was not anger. It was the face of someone processing a catastrophic error and already moving toward its containment. "Eleanor Tatum," he said. Not a question. Just her name, tested against the air of the hallway, measured against something internal. "Yes, sir, by the photograph along the north wall. He's been at it for several minutes." The colonel was already moving. He took 3 steps, stopped, and turned back to the deputy installation commander with a look that communicated everything in advance of the words. "Find General Alcott," he said. "Now, tell him Tatum is here." A pause. "Tell him Holloway has his hand on her sleeve." The deputy installation commander had 22 years of service. He had 2 combat deployments, a master's degree in strategic studies, and a file of professional experiences that covered a wide range of unusual situations. He went completely still for 2 full seconds. Then, he said, "I'll find all 3 generals." Colonel Reese nodded once. "Fast," he said, and was already gone. In the secondary communication room off the main corridor, a yeoman named Pierce watched the deputy installation commander enter at, something between a walk and a run, and pick up a desk phone with both hands and begin a series of calls that lasted 4 minutes and ended with 3 separate officers being pulled from 3 separate conversations and pointed in the same direction simultaneously. Pierce did not know what name had been spoken, but he had been in the Army long enough to know that when a deputy installation commander made a call that made 3 generals stand up at once, something was happening that would still be talked about at this installation when everyone currently in this building had long since retired. Back in the Heritage Center, Holloway had moved into his 3rd phase. His voice had dropped into the register of formal warning, calm, procedural. The tone of institutional authority preparing to act. "Mrs. Totham," he said, "I've given you more latitude than this situation warrants. I have a responsibility to the security of this event. I'm going to need you to come with me to the security station, where we can verify your invitation and your identity through proper channels. This is not optional. If you decline, I'll be forced to." The main doors of the Heritage Center opened. Not dramatically. They simply opened, both of them at once, swinging wide with the quiet inevitability of things pushed by people who have not slowed down to consider their weight. The sound of the hinges, a low, resonant groan that the marble floors amplified and threw across the room, arrived before the figures did, and in the half-second between the sound and the sight, the entire room seemed to hold the breath that the marble had just released. Colonel Reese came through first, moving at the pace of controlled urgency, not running, because colonels do not run through Heritage Center receptions, but covering ground with an efficiency that communicated everything running would have. Brigadier General Sandra Alcott came a half-step behind him, her dress uniform immaculate, her face arranged in the specific neutrality of a senior officer approaching a situation that she has already assessed and found intolerable. And filling the doorframe behind her, taking a single step across the threshold, and then pausing for just a moment in that particular way that large authority sometimes pauses, to allow the room to fully receive what has arrived, was General William Kavanaugh Park. 3 stars. 38 years. A man whose name appeared in 2 history books covering Southeast Asian operations, and who had been in the middle of explaining a procurement position to a senator's aide when a colonel had walked in without knocking and said a name, and who had stood up from his chair before the sentence was finished and had not sat down since. His dress uniform caught the light of the chandelier overhead. His shoes on the marble made the only sound in the room that mattered now. From the side corridor, 2 more officers in dress blues materialized at a measured pace and took up positions flanking the main entrance, not blocking it, simply present, the way serious things are present, without announcement or explanation. The noise of the room did not die. It simply ceased to generate. Every conversation stopped. Every glass was set down. Every head turned. General Park's eyes found Eleanor Grace Tatum without searching. He moved across the room in a straight line, and every person between him and that line stepped out of it without being asked. His eyes moved once to Holloway, to the hand, still hovering near Eleanor's sleeve, still not quite touching, and the eyes narrowed to something that Holloway had never personally seen directed at him before, and hoped never to see again. Holloway's hand dropped. General Park stopped in front of Eleanor Tatum. He was 3 inches taller than her. He was 61 years old, 3 stars on his shoulders, and he had been in the Army for 38 years. He looked at the small silver pin on her cardigan for a count of 2. Then he saluted. It was not a casual salute. It was not the functional salute of daily protocol. It was the sharpest, most precise, most breathtakingly deliberate salute that Captain Derek Holloway had ever seen executed in his 4 years of commissioned service. A salute delivered with the full weight of a 3-star general's body and history and understanding, directed at an 81-year-old woman in a gray cardigan who was holding a canvas tote bag from a hardware store. Brigadier General Alcott saluted. Colonel Reese saluted. A sound moved through the Heritage Center that was not a gasp and not a murmur, but the acoustic equivalent of a collective intake of breath that has nowhere to go. Holloway's face had gone the color of paper. Eleanor Tatum returned the salute with a precision that should not have been possible from someone who had not worn a uniform in 43 years, but was, because some things, once trained into the body, do not leave it. Sergeant Major Tatum, General Park said. His voice was even, controlled, carrying the careful neutrality of a man who is choosing his words with great care, because the alternative is not neutral. I'm deeply sorry for any inconvenience you have encountered today. I've endured worse, she said. I know, he said. We all know. He turned then, and he looked at Captain Derek Holloway with the full weight of that knowledge. Holloway's 2 junior officers had gone rigidly to attention without being ordered. The room, the entire gathered room of officers and dignitaries and visiting civilians, was watching in a silence that had become its own presence. Captain, General Park said, step to one side. Holloway stepped. General Park looked at the assembled room. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Eleanor Grace Tatum, he said, entered the Army in 1964. She served 4 tours in Southeast Asia in signals intelligence and forward communications operations under MACSOG, operations that were classified for 30 years after she completed them. Her team's frequency work during the 1968 siege of Dokdo provided real-time intelligence that enabled the extraction of 3 surrounded companies. She was wounded twice. She received the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with Valor, the Meritorious Service Medal, and, this building being what it is, and this occasion being what it is, I think it's worth saying clearly, she was among the first group of women in the Army's history to receive the combat service recognition that this institution is named for, which is why her name is on the wall you are all standing 30 feet away from. He paused. That pin, he said, was given to her by Master Sergeant Roosevelt Tanner in 1968. It belonged to Specialist Diane Kowalczyk of Akron, Ohio, who died on a frequency board while keeping a team alive. The Army remembers Specialist Kowalczyk. The Army remembers Sergeant Major Tatum. He looked at Holloway once more. The Army does not forget. The silence in the room was absolute. Captain Derek Holloway received a formal letter of reprimand that afternoon, the first of a series of procedural consequences that would follow him through the next reassignment cycle and redirect the trajectory of a career that had, until that afternoon, been proceeding with unearned smoothness. He was transferred to a logistics post in a location that offered very few opportunities for heritage receptions. He attended a mandatory leadership development course that was, by his own later admission, the first time in his professional life that someone had explained to him the difference between institutional rank and earned authority. But before any of that happened, Eleanor Tatum crossed the marble floor of the Heritage Center and stopped in front of him. She was not tall. She was 81 years old and wearing sensible shoes, She placed one hand on his arm, the same arm that had reached toward her sleeve, and she held it there for a moment. And when she spoke, her voice carried no triumph and no warmth and no coldness. It carried only the quality of someone who has lived long enough to have learned the one true thing and has stopped needing to announce it. "The rank helps you," she said. "I understand that. I used mine the same way once." She paused. "But the rank is the door. What you do once you're through it, that's the whole rest of the building. You're young. You have time to figure out what's inside." She looked at the silver pin at her collar, just briefly. "Some of us paid for the lesson in a coin you haven't been asked to spend yet. Don't waste that." She went back to the photograph on the wall. She stood there for a long time, and the room let her. 11 weeks later, at a hardware store on the edge of Fayetteville, a man in civilian clothes was standing in front of a pegboard display of weather seals when he noticed an elderly woman in a gray cardigan comparing two sizes of wood screws with the focused attention of someone for whom the right answer mattered. Captain Derek Holloway, no longer in uniform for the afternoon, thinner than he had been in the fall, carrying a quality of quietness that had not been there before, recognized her immediately. He stood for a moment. Then he walked over. She did not look up from the screws until he said her name. "Sergeant Major Tatum." She looked at him. Her pale gray eyes held no performance of any kind, not warmth, not coldness, not the distant satisfaction of the vindicated. She simply looked at him with the patience of someone who has waited out longer silences than this. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one, not a formal one." He paused. "I didn't see you, and I should have. I should have looked harder before I opened my mouth, and I didn't, and I'm sorry." Eleanor Grace Tatum looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she reached into her canvas tote and produced a small piece of paper. "I came in for cedar shims," she said. "The man at the counter said they were in aisle 7, but I keep finding aisle 8. Walk me there, Captain." He walked her there. They found the shims. She thanked him and moved on toward the register. And he stood in aisle 7 for a moment in the thin winter light coming through the hardware store's high windows, and it occurred to him, for the first time with the clarity of something actually understood rather than merely processed, that he had just been given something by a woman who had every reason to give him nothing. He thought about that for a long time. The quiet ones walk among us every day, the keepers of costs we didn't pay, carrying their histories in cardigan pins and worn shoes, and the particular stillness of those who have seen the weight of things and learned to hold them without showing the strain. We mistake their silence for absence. We mistake their ordinary clothing for ordinariness. We look for greatness in the shine and miss it in the grain. If you were moved by Eleanor's story of quiet courage and timeless wisdom, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes.